Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's town hall. My name is Daniel Blaikie. I'm your Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona, and I'm also going to be your host this evening. I want to welcome you all to tonight's live and interactive telephone town hall discussion. I'm excited to be here with you tonight and take your questions. Right now, my team is calling thousands of your neighbors from across the riding. It's going to take a few minutes to connect with everyone, so as we're dialing out, let me just take a moment to explain how a telephone town hall works. It might be old hat for some of you on the line now because we've done a number of these over the years. But for those who are new to the call, I'm just going to go over the basics. So right now, people from across Elmwood-Transcona are answering their phones. They're connecting to this discussion. In a way, it's a bit like a traditional town hall where guests arrive and file in through the front door, except instead of a front door, there are thousands of phones ringing throughout Elmwood-Transcona. Once someone answers their phone, they can just stay on the line to join this discussion. And for those who missed the call, an answering machine message will be left with directions on how to call into the discussion. This telephone town hall technology enables us to reach out and talk with thousands of people from the comfort of their homes, which is nice even in normal times, but during the pandemic is an especially great tool to be able to hear directly from residents here in the riding and connect with you to ensure that you can hear from me directly and I get an opportunity to hear your questions and answer them live right on the phone. So for those of you who now may be just joining the call, welcome. I'm Daniel Blaikie, your Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona. I see we've still got some more phones to call. So as we're waiting for everyone to join, I just want to kick off the event a little bit with a topic that I know is on everybody's minds as we approach the one-year anniversary of the beginning of the pandemic here in Canada, and that's the vaccine rollout. A lot of people have called into the office. They're wondering what's going on with the vaccine rollout. And of course, if you've been following in the papers, you'll know that there have been some pretty considerable problems with the way that the vaccine rollout has taken place. We've seen a number of delays on the federal side in terms of getting vaccine into Canada and delivered to the provinces. And on the provincial side, we also saw earlier on when vaccines were coming into the province that there was a real lack of readiness. I mean, one example was just how late the province chose to hire somebody that was actually going to be the lead coordinator for the vaccine rollout here in Manitoba. So for those of you just joining on the call, I'm Daniel Blaikie. I'm your Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona, and I'm here tonight for a telephone town hall discussion. That means you're going to get an opportunity to ask questions and share your thoughts through real-time interactive quick polls. If you have a question, just press *3 on your phone at any time. An operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask your question live. So now looking at our system, I can see that there are a lot of people who are joining us on the line. There's still more to join. So before we officially begin, just to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind, I just want to go back to the vaccine rollout and talk a bit more about that. I think, one of the things that we've seen with the vaccine rollout that has been a real challenge as far as the NDP is concerned and a frustration as far as the NDP is concerned is a real lack of federal leadership. And so again, I mean, if you've been following it in the paper or on the nightly news, what you'll have seen is that depending on what province you live in, the vaccine rollout has been very different. And that's because the federal government decided to take a very hands-off role. And I think it's a problem, frankly, that we haven't seen more federal leadership. And so in response to that, the NDP proposed a plan recently to address that. And it really does call on the federal government to get more actively involved, including looking at options for deploying the military within Canada to assist provinces in delivering the vaccine, because we know that resources have been one of the ongoing challenges of this pandemic. There's just not enough resources in the health system to be able to do all of the things that we need to do. And the military can be a really important asset in times like these in order to increase that capacity with competent, talented people who are familiar with the logistics of taking on these kinds of projects and getting the job done. So that's something that we've been very clear in calling for, And the other piece of that strategy that I've had an opportunity to push a fair bit in Parliament as the NDP's international trade critic has to do with how we go about securing vaccines for Canada, and particularly how we go about producing vaccines in Canada. Canada really stands alone among a lot of our typical allies in not having any domestic vaccine production at all. And I've had the opportunity to challenge, for instance, the International Trade Minister at committee on these things. We've raised this issue in the House. The NDP is the only party that's been calling for not just public investment, but public ownership of facilities that would allow us to produce vaccine here in Canada, as many of our allies have done. And when you put those questions to the government, and when you hear Conservatives talk about it in Ottawa as well, there's a real emphasis for them on global supply chains and the idea that, you know, companies are going to deliver if they have the right incentives. And that's not new. That's something we've seen in Canada over the last 30 years. It was the Conservative government of Brian Mulroney that actually privatized the last facility that Canada had that was publicly owned that produced vaccines. That was in the late 80s. And ever since, we've seen federal governments of both stripes, Liberal and Conservative, privatizing that kind of public infrastructure. So there's a political difference, to be sure. There's a philosophical difference. And New Democrats very much believe that Canadians should be investing. You know, it's one thing to import luxury goods and different kinds of things that are nice to have. It's another thing when it comes down to some of those really core essential pieces. We want a Canada that is able to produce those things here as much as possible and ensure that we're not depending on other countries who are looking out for themselves first and foremost in order to get the things that are vital to the health and safety of Canadians. So those are some of the big picture pieces that the NDP has really been pushing on when it comes to the vaccine strategy, and some of the things that we felt have really been missing from that. So I know there's going to be some people who are joining just in the middle of that. I was talking a little bit about vaccines and the vaccine issue here in Canada as we had more people join. So for those of you who have, just so you know, if you don't recognize my voice already, my name is Daniel Blaikie. I'm the Member of Parliament for Elmwood-Transcona. And if you have a question for me this evening, all you have to do is press *3 on your phone at any point during the call. An operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask that question live. So I think we are ready to get going. I'd like to kick things off with just a little bit of a straw poll. So on that note, we'll dive right into that with our first poll question. Do you believe we need stronger federal leadership on the vaccine rollout, including a national mass vaccination plan that deploys the military to administer the vaccine as quickly as possible? Press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree. Press 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree. And I'll say that again. Do you believe we need stronger federal leadership on the vaccine rollout, including a national mass vaccination plan that deploys the military to administer the vaccine as quickly as possible? Press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree. And press 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree. Thank you very much for letting me know what you think. I want to remind everyone that you can get in line to ask a question by pressing *3, and an operator will take down your question and put you in line to ask your questions live. So we've got a good critical mass of people on the line, and just before we get into the Q&A, the other topic that I really want to touch on, I know has been a major concern for people here in Elmwood-Transcona and has been a big part of the national conversation, has been the total tragedy of long-term care in Canada and what many moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and brothers and sisters have faced who are living in long-term care. because we have seen that the great majority of deaths in Canada as a result of COVID-19 have taken place in long-term care, where our loved ones are and where they're vulnerable. And where we've known, frankly, for a long time that we need to make more investment, but haven't done it. And I always, when we talk about long-term care, I always feel remiss if I don't mention, as an example of a really significant wasted opportunity to make those kinds of investments in Park Manor. Park Manor is a facility that served the Transcona area very well for a long time. It's something that the care home had done a lot of work to prepare plans for an expansion and a renovation. The funding was in place, the drawings were done, the permit was there, everything was ready to go. It was a shovel-ready project. And when the government changed in Manitoba, going back to 2016 now, one of the first acts after Brian Pallister, as leader of the Conservative Party, made an announcement during the campaign outside of Park Manor talking about the need for more long-term care beds. One of the first things they did after the campaign was cancel that project. I still think it was a terrible shame. We know that through this pandemic, congregate living arrangements have been one of the big risk factors, and Park Manor remains one of the few personal care homes in Manitoba that still have still have 4 people to a room, for instance. So I raise that because I really do think when we talk about things like this, it's important to know that these decisions have long-term impacts, and you don't always know what's coming in the future. But if you're making the right investments, then you're more ready when the unexpected comes in order to be able to deal with those things. So the NEP is committed to what we call a care guarantee for seniors, that seniors and their loved ones know that seniors are being well taken care of when they need that help, whether that's in a long-term care facility or whether that's at home through better home care. One of the ways we want to do that is by getting the profit motive out of long-term care. We know that there's been a disproportionately high number of deaths in for-profit long-term care homes. The numbers show that very clearly, because minding that financial bottom line has too often meant that companies are cutting corners. We know that we need national standards. We need to get the provinces together around the table with the federal government to develop those standards, and then we need a plan to fund them so that it doesn't matter where you live in the country, you're guaranteed to get good care rather than leaving it to where you happen to live in the country and the government of the day. And the last real important piece of that puzzle is to recognize that the working conditions of people in long-term care are the conditions of care for our elders. And so if we're not paying people properly, if we don't have adequate staffing ratios, if we don't have regular inspections, all of those things are the things that end up meaning that they don't get the care that they need. So so that's what the NEP wants to see coming out of Ottawa. It's a similar point to the vaccine, which is more federal leadership instead of passing the buck to the provinces. And I think it's been disappointing for a lot of Canadians. It's been disappointing for the NDP to see the blame game being played on both sides of the fence between certainly here in our province and Ottawa, and we've seen that in a number of provinces where the buck keeps getting passed between governments when the focus really should be on ensuring Canadians are getting the support that they need. So I think I've talked enough to start us off. I just want to remind you that all you have to do is press *3 on your phone to get in line to ask a question. An operator is going to take down your question and put you in the queue. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic, as it were, to Ariel, who's on the line to help moderate our questions. And Ariel, if you could give us our first question, that would be great.
Hi, thank you. So our first question is from Tom, and so he's wondering about a specific question about vaccines. So Tom, you are live now if you want to ask Daniel your question.
Yes, I was wondering, do you have any idea what people in their 50s and 60s will be getting their vaccine.
I don't know exactly. So that's, I think part of it is that there's been so much uncertainty about vaccine delivery, and then the province has to figure out, once they know when they're getting those vaccine doses, how they're going to roll that out. So there certainly has been some uncertainty about that. What I do know, and I don't have the link ready to hand, but if you wanted to follow up with my office, we'd be happy to get it for you. The province of Manitoba has created a website with a kind of vaccine date calculator. I did it myself, but as somebody in my mid-30s, it was quite some ways away. But it'll tell you kind of where in the queue you would land, pretty much based on your age. And I can't recall if it tries to give a timeline or if it just tells you where in the queue you would be. So that's a resource if you're online and you want to Google that and look for that. And if you can't find it, please do follow up with my office. That's something we would be happy to point you to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your question, Tom. And let's go on to the next one right away here. The next question is going to be from Glenn, and Glenn has a question about Bill C7. Glenn?
Hi.
Glenn, you should, perfect. You're live now.
Okay, great. My oldest son is severely autistic. He's functionally nonverbal. And with Bill C7 now going through third reading, and after the Senate's giving its input, I have a concern, not that it's actually in the bill itself, but what is the NDP's position on protections for people who are not going to be able to consent in the future to medically assisted in dying? So, like, my thoughts are, like, what happens if I'm no longer here and my son's older and we have this bill in place? Who speaks for him? Right now, it appears to me that there's a panel. I'm not sure what the accountability is for that panel. I'm also not sure what the metrics would be to determine both level of cognition and the need for something like that. So, like, I have a big concern. I just wanted to know what your position was on that.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question, Glenn. And I know that this issue has, is obviously one of those really important issues that touches on the question of life and death, and the debate in the House has gotten quite heated at certain points. What I can say is that, to my knowledge, there's nothing that allows any institutional person to give consent to medical assistance in dying to anybody else. And I think that the concern, so they can evaluate somebody's request, but they can't make the decision for somebody else. One of the things that's come up in the context of Bill C7, which is the bill that that the government has moved now to change the medical assistance in dying regime. So that bill passed in the House. Then it went to the Senate, and the Senate has passed an amendment that, if it were to be approved by the House, would allow for essentially mental health conditions to be in and of themselves enough to get access to medical assistance in dying. This is something that we need a real conversation about. It's not something that just coming from an unelected Senate, frankly, without the kind of study and conversation that we need to have on that is the way to go. So we are going to be voting on that issue soon, and myself, along with my colleagues in the NDP, are going to be voting against broadening medical assistance in dying even more than the original Bill C7 envisioned, because there is supposed to be a big legislative review of the original medical assistance in dying legislation. It was supposed to happen after 5 years. The government, despite calls from the NDP and others in order to get that review going, hasn't gotten it going. And so we really think that we need to get that review underway so that there's an appropriate forum to talk about these things. The process around Bill C7, clearly was dissatisfying to a lot of people. And if we're going to do it better and come to decisions in a way that more Canadians find acceptable, we need a better process. And that legislative review is really the beginning point for that. So when it comes to what I think you're referring to, which are those Senate amendments, the answer is that I'll be voting against those.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for that question, Glenn. Before we go on to the next question, let's look at the poll results from our first polling question. Daniel, why don't you remind everybody what that was?
Sure. So the question we had asked was, do you believe we need a stronger federal leadership on the vaccine rollout, including a national mass vaccination plan that deploys the military to administer the vaccine as quickly as possible? And we heard from 54% of people who strongly agree with that, 29% who somewhat agree, 10% who somewhat disagree, and 7% who strongly disagree with that. So thank you guys very much for weighing in on that question, and I'll kick it back to you, Ariel, to take another question.
Absolutely. So our next question is going to be from Marge, and she has some questions about some of the healthcare cuts that we've seen in Northeast Winnipeg. So, Marge, you should be live now.
Yes, I am.
Perfect. Do you want to
Hi, Marge.
answer your
How are you
question?
doing?
I'm doing fine. I've just been really upset at all the cuts at Concordia Hospital. Next, it's going to be the lab and the cancer care, and they've taken away the physiotherapy. And this area is growing like leaps and bounds, and that hospital is just a wonderful hospital. And why are they not utilizing it?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I certainly share your frustration both at the way that the Conservative government here in Manitoba has dealt with Concordia Hospital, but also a number of other big cuts to health services here in Northeast Winnipeg. I was reading in the paper just recently an article about testing and different kinds of medical tests, so not just COVID tests, but again, and I think this speaks to how different the experience can be depending on what province you're in. It was talking about how, provinces where they have really big centralized labs haven't been able to add capacity as quickly in some cases for testing as places that have more smaller labs. And one of the things that we've been seeing is smaller lab and satellite locations like the one that was here in Transcona and one close to Concordia Hospital being closed down to get these lab super centers, and that takes some flex out of the system. I think for people to have lost the cancer care satellite site out of Concordia Hospital right in the middle of the pandemic, making them having to travel further and to more busy hospitals in order to get their cancer treatment when they're already vulnerable is a decision that does not make sense to me. It doesn't seem to be one that's driven by a patient-centered approach at all. And some of you may know I've made a big stink about it because I think it's important to do that. The community IV program here in Transcona was closed. Now, we eventually found out, or were told, that this was a temporary closure due to COVID, but I found out about it from a patient who called me up just a couple days before they closed the site and said, hey, I just heard from my nurse who just found out today that they're closing the Transcona community IV program. The missive that they gave to staff didn't say it was temporary, and they only said it was temporary after I held a press conference outside the Access Transcona Center with Wab Canoe and area New Democrats like Nello Altamar and Matt Weeb to say, hey, what's going on here? This is wrong. And then we got a statement from the WRHA saying, oh, it's just temporary. So we're going to continue to hold the Conservative government's feet to the fire on that and make sure that it is a temporary closure and, push them to be accountable for their promise to get that reopened as soon as it's feasible to do so. And the health minister has since changed. I've written a letter to the new health minister to remind her of that commitment by her government and to get a sense of the timeline for that. And we really do need local leadership here in Northeast Winnipeg to be pushing back against these cuts, because if nobody's making noise about this, we've got a government that's made it very clear that they want to close these services. They think it's a good idea. I strongly disagree with that, but it's clear that that's where they're at for whatever reasons. That's what they want to do. And we need to be constantly pushing back against them to defend having health services close to home here in Northeast Winnipeg. And I definitely see that as an important part of my job. I wonder, because we're just talking about healthcare now, it might be a good time to go ahead with our second polling question. I wanted to ask folks, do you believe Canada needs national standards for long-term care and home care that are enforced according to the principles of the Canada Health Act? So press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree, and 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree. So again, the question is, do you believe Canada needs national standards for long-term care and home care that are enforced according to the principles of the Canada Health Act? Press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree, and press 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that poll. It's certainly a hot topic right now, both in Ottawa and across the country at the provincial level, how we tackle this problem in long-term care, and I very much appreciate hearing from you on that. So Ariel, while people are doing that, and as we wait for that result to be tallied, could you give us another question from the queue, please?
Absolutely. So our next question is going to be from Jean. And Jean has some questions about CPP and OAS. So Jean, you should be live now.
What do you mean, John?
John, sorry, I apologize. You are...
No, that's okay. That's okay. You got my French name. It's the same thing. Yeah, Danielle, a long time ago, years ago, Jack was still alive at the time. The NDP put a bill in the House in regards to increasing the CPP, and I think at the time it was $1,700. And then the OAC, Old Age Security, was also supposed to be increased by double. Is the NDP going to bring that bill back into the House, or seniors are still going to have to suffer?
Well, thanks for the question, John. And the answer is that we are still very much pushing for increases in the CPP and the OAS. So just to give you an example, like we've called out the government recently for not living up to their commitment from the campaign, which was just over a year ago, to raise the old age security. And of course, they've said, well, we can't do it because of the pandemic. What we've been saying is it's exactly because of the pandemic that you need to act with even more urgency, because we know seniors, many seniors are struggling to get through this. We know people have been facing increased costs, whether it's grocery delivery or laundry services, things that people, if they're not able to do it all themselves, have had family members or friends or volunteers in the community sometimes helping out with those things, and because of the pandemic and the public health orders, haven't been able to rely on that same support network. So that all comes with additional costs. And so this is exactly the time to be moving to support seniors better. Now, even if the Liberals did implement their campaign commitment, what we've been saying is that that's not enough, because they only committed to raising the old age security for seniors who are 75 and older. And we know that there are a lot of seniors between 65 and 74 who are struggling and who do need to see that increase as well. And it's similar when it comes to the Canada Pension Plan as well. Like, we know that the Canada Pension Plan is just not keeping up with the cost of living, and it hasn't been for a long time. Every year, the purchasing power of the Canada Pension Plan, or the amount of money that seniors are getting relative to the cost of things, that gap is growing. And it might only grow a little bit every year, but it's been growing a little bit every year for 25 or 30 years now. And people are just getting too far behind. So we do need to act on that. I think it's a good investment, because when we're talking about supporting our poorest seniors, we're talking about people who are going to spend that money in the community. And that becomes money that moves through our local businesses here, It's money that generates tax revenue for government as well. So these are people who are going to keep that money moving in the local economy. And I see it as an investment both in the dignity of our seniors, but also an investment in our local economy. So yes, John, absolutely, we continue to push for better income support for Canada's seniors.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that answer, Daniel. I think we should move it on to the next question. Our next question is from Pam, and she has a question about pharmacies. Hi, Pam. You should be live with us now. Do you want to ask Daniel your question?
Yes, my question is, I'm 81 years old and I live alone, and I have heard on and off all through this COVID that they're going to allow pharmacists to give the COVID shot, and it would certainly help people like me. I don't really see how I'm going to get down to the convention center to get a shot when it would be so much better to be able to go to one of the bigger drugstores or somewhere else that's in this area where we could go to. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And what I'll say is that I do support that idea. I think, and this is consistent with what we've been saying about healthcare in Northeast Winnipeg generally. What we want is for people to be able to access the health services that they need closer to home, and that includes being able to get the vaccine. So I would like to see it roll out that way. I'm cognizant of the fact that that's going to be a decision, unless the federal government does get involved in a more assertive leadership role. That's going to be a decision that's taken by the provincial government, but it's certainly a decision that I would encourage them to take, because I think it's really important that people are able to access the vaccine, and that barriers like transportation, or even for those who are able to drive but are nervous about parking downtown or walking around downtown and all of those kinds of things, people should be able to get this close to home. So I do think that's really important, and it's something that I would certainly encourage.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that question, and Daniel for that answer. I think we should move right into the next question. Our next question is from Hilario. Hilario has a question about airlines. Hi, Hilario. You should be live now. Do you want to answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, my question is, Liberal are doing good. As an NDP, as Bill Blaikie here in Transcona, he should get along with the Liberal, because I've been suffering for a year now. Nothing I can do, because they shut it down. It's a people choice. It's not a God willing. My point is, right now, the vaccine, all we know, United States is first one to get the vaccine because of Biden won. During Trump, we don't want to pay because it's his government. It's not like Canada. Canada, we have free health care. Every individual pay, in the United States. So for us, nothing we can do. We only rely mostly in America. But Trudeau have a plan to get the vaccine made in Canada, but we don't have that before. I agree with that. But NDP trying to push that to have that, but we don't know because it's happening right now. They're not prepared, but they're trying to get one. But as I said, NDP should help it out. I mean, I know I like NDP too, I like Liberal too, but the situation right now, what you're going to do if you're battling each other? Help each other. That's all the most important thing. We are in Manitoba. The Manitoba government should have a part too, because we pay taxes, we pay everything. I pay all my taxes even I landed here. So, I mean, my question is, instead of battling, help each other. That's the way I can say. And what's he going to do about airline? You cannot transport Blaikie to Ottawa by himself, because the cost of only the fuel of the airline, we have to have We have to have.
Yeah, well, thank you both for the question and for the commentary. So there's two aspects there that I want to address. So one has to do with this Parliament, and it certainly has been quite an unusual Parliament. So I'm going to come to that in a minute, but I want to start just by speaking to the issue of the airlines, and I think this is where you definitely see some political tensions develop, because the NDP certainly has some ideas about what we need to do for the airline industry, both in terms of passenger airline, but also in terms of the aerospace industry generally. Both of them have taken a serious hit as a result of the pandemic. It's almost been a year that we've been in the pandemic, and unlike many of our allies, Canada does not have a strategy. So most other countries are investing in their airline industry. They're finding a way to make sure that that when things do finally clear up, that there's going to be a path back for the companies that engage in passenger travel, but they're also trying to keep the manufacturing in aerospace alive. A lot of those companies have seen canceled orders. I've met with companies. There's a lot of aerospace manufacturing here in Winnipeg. It's a really important industry. Produces some really good quality jobs that support families, and it's also a strategic industry when we think about Canada's place in the world. And there just has been no plan. It took forever to get the government to tell airlines that they needed to actually give people their money back for canceled flights, long after other countries had done the right thing and told them that. And even when they did that, a lot of airline companies, and I know because I've met with a lot of independent travel agents, including ones who live and work right here in Northeast Winnipeg, so they sell flights and they get paid commissions, and the airline's position was that they weren't going to refund customers until the travel agents paid the company the commission back. And that really put the squeeze on, tons of independent travel agents who were also hit hard by the pandemic and don't have the resources of an Air Canada or a WestJet in order to be able to weather the storm, don't have access to a wage subsidy because they just work for themselves, in many cases out of their basement or out of their home. And at no time was the government stepping in to say, hey, this is a big industry and there are a lot of players, including a lot of small players, and we need a solution that's fair for everyone, that's fair for the workers, that's fair for small business people like independent travel agents, as well as ensuring that some of these bigger companies that are important to the industry, but by no means not the entire industry, come out on the other side. And so a real failure of leadership there, and it's those kinds of things that cause friction in Ottawa when you're advocating fiercely for something and the government is refusing to act. That's certainly where you get some of that tension. Now, I don't think it's any secret that I disagree with the Liberals on a lot of things. Just today in Parliament, we had a vote on an NDP bill to establish a national pharmacare program in law, and the Liberals have been campaigning on that since 1997, and they voted against it, and it didn't pass. I just watched it happen from the same desk that I'm speaking to you from right now, and that was very frustrating. But I ran, and the NDP ran in the last election on a commitment to make Parliament work for people. And so, for as much as we have those disagreements, and we are going to disagree, and you are going to hear those disagreements. You're going to hear about them, and you're going to hear about the things the NDP would do differently. We have worked hard to set those differences aside, to be able to collaborate on making sure people are supported through this pandemic. And I've got a lot of criticisms for how the Liberals have handled things. I've been, as the NDP's critic for the employment insurance system, I also ended up being one of our lead negotiators on things like CERB. I've sat across the table, so to speak, usually negotiating on the phone, as part of our negotiating team on those things. And I know that us being there and pushing the Liberals made a difference. There were a lot more supports for Canadians that wouldn't have been there because the Liberals wanted to figure out how they could do less. So when they said, let's have a wage subsidy to support workers, they said 10%, we said 75%. Eventually, working with the business community, we got that brought up to a higher percentage to make sure that that support was there. It was similar on CERB and other things. So absolutely, I'm going to continue to criticize this Liberal government. We got extra sittings of Parliament in the summer. We were part of pushing on the We Charity scandal. And eventually, you know, Bill Morneau, who had been the finance minister and holding up a lot of important programs to support Canadians, had to bow out because of some of the inappropriate relationships between the government and the We Charity and the We Charity. So there's a job to do, and I'm going to hold this government to account, but I'm also willing to work with them in the spirit that you're talking about, Hilario, in order to put the interests of people first. It's not always easy to do. We don't always have a cooperative partner on the other end. You know, the government's not exactly very helpful in that regard sometimes, but I am committed to working as much as possible with people on all sides of the House in Ottawa to make this minority parliament work and make it work for the people who really need support in this difficult time. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it was a fulsome one, and you have a good sense of where I'm at on that and where the NDP is at on that.
And thank you so much for that, Daniel. Before we go on to the next question, I think we'll toss it back to the poll results. So if you want to remind everybody what our second polling question was before we go to our next caller. You can get everyone
the question we had asked was, do you believe Canada needs national standards for long-term care and home care that are enforced according to the principles of the Canada Health Act? 79% of people on the call strongly agree with that. 15% somewhat agree, 4% somewhat disagree, and only 2% strongly disagree. So thank you, everyone, for participating in that poll. We are going to have one more poll before we're done tonight, and maybe I'll just set that one up, and we can move to that one now, and then I can announce those results at the very end of the call tonight. One of the issues that's been, another hot topic in Ottawa has been the question of whether we have an election during the pandemic or not. And this was something that I was the first to raise in Parliament. I wrote a letter as early as last June to all of the other parties to say I think we should talk about this over the summer. There's election speculation. There's rumors that the Liberals would like to have an election, and there are some real challenges with it. I didn't hear back over the summer, but in the fall, I was able to get the Procedure and House Affairs Committee of Parliament to study the issue. And we heard from the people who run elections. We've heard from public health officials. We heard from people who represent communities that may very well have real barriers to voting during a pandemic. People living with disabilities, Indigenous communities, seniors, students, long-term care facilities, all of like a whole gamut of different groups and the possible effects. And I think one of the things we've heard loud and clear is that there really is no way to guarantee an election that can both protect public health and protect our democracy. And so we're seeing that problem right now in Newfoundland and Labrador. Some of you on the call may be aware of this, but Newfoundland and Labrador are having an election. It was supposed to have been over by now, but they had an outbreak of the new B117 variant, I think, the one that comes from the UK, just a couple of weeks before Election Day. And so what happened then was that the people who were supposed to work the election were refusing to go in because they were fearful for their own health and safety. And there were some really, big public health concerns, obviously, as well, in terms of having a whole bunch of people show up at local schools and the other places that we normally vote. So right now, their election date has been kicked back a couple times. And just in the lead up to what was supposed to be Election Day, they've now made the decision that they're going to go to all mail-in ballots only. And there's already people saying that they're going to have to, that there will be legal challenges as to whether or not the election was constitutional or not. Our point in the NDP has been we're already having a public health crisis. We're already having an economic crisis. We don't need a political crisis. So MPs have to act like grown-ups we can have our differences, we can argue about what the best policy is, but we ultimately need to roll up our sleeves, get to the table, and hammer out compromises that are going to put the interests of Canadians first, with the idea of avoiding an election. And that really does, it takes every MP and it takes every party to be committed to that in order to make it work. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for that. The question that I want to ask is whether you believe it would be responsible for Justin Trudeau to call an election during the pandemic. You can press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree that it would be responsible to have an election. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree that it would be responsible. Press 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree with the idea of an election in the pandemic. So again, the third polling question is, do you believe it would be responsible for Justin Trudeau to call an election during the pandemic? Press 1 on your phone if you strongly agree. Press 2 on your phone if you somewhat agree. Press 3 on your phone if you somewhat disagree. And press 4 on your phone if you strongly disagree and believe we should not be having an election during the pandemic. So thank you for letting me set that up, and thank you for participating in that poll. Ariel, I'm going to kick it back over to you to get another question from the queue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. So our next question is going to be from Darlene, and Darlene has a question about Phoenix. And Darlene, you should be live now if you want to ask Daniel your question.
Hello.
Hi, Darlene. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to look or to talk a little bit about the Phoenix pay system disaster. It's been 5 years that we have been dealing with the mistakes that were made and shortchanged a lot of money. And from what I understand, March 3rd we're supposed to be getting damages, and general damages should not be taxed. And from what I understand, the federal government has decided to rush these payments out without CRA getting a chance to issue proper ruling on taxability. And we have made a formal request to you and to other MPs to do the right thing and fix this before payments are issued. So I'm wondering if that's going to be addressed or not.
Well, thank you for that question, Darlene. And just some context for, I'm sure these are things you know, Darlene, but for those who are on the call that aren't familiar with the Phoenix pay fiasco, this was a new payroll system that the Conservative government had begun the planning on, that the Liberals had implemented, despite there being a lot of warnings from all over the place, from IBM, from the union, from their own departments, that it wasn't ready to go. And I know because I was the critic in the last Parliament for this. I was the lead for the NDP and heard from tons of civil servants who were going into work every day and not getting paid for the work that they were doing, and not getting paid properly. Sometimes that meant less pay. Sometimes it meant overpayment. And then the government was demanding all of that money back at once after it had been systematically overpaying people. We talked to people who lost their homes over it. We talked to people who were having, who were going through a divorce and having custody arguments, and because they lost their income, it impacted how much they could see their kids. I mean, this had a lot of real, tangible, bad consequences for many people who work for the federal government. And now the government has been ordered to pay damages for that. And I think, adding insult to injury, this was something that the Liberals could have handled very differently. They've said that they want to tax those damages payments, which is not the norm. And I think there will be, questions about whether what they're doing is allowed or not. And I think, our view is that these are damages being paid out because the government already did a lot of harm to people. They're not finally just paying people their wages. They're paying them damages for really negative consequences. And it doesn't make sense for people to be paying tax on those damages, and it doesn't do the job that those things might otherwise have done in terms of acknowledging the harm that a government did and trying to get that relationship back on track. Morale in workplaces that have been affected by Phoenix has been terrible. And of course, that has an impact on the workplace and, whether people want to stay and how, and the whole work culture there. So this was an opportunity for the Liberals to kind of make amends and get things back on track. And the way that they've chosen to handle this by calling into doubt whether people are going to get the full payment or not, I think has just done far more harm than good. So I thank you for the question. I hope that, and I hope you know that, as the NEP has been through all of this, fighting for people who have been affected by this, we continue to be in their corner. And we think this is something that the government really needs to go above and beyond to make amends for.
Thank you so much for that answer, Daniel. Before we take what might end up being our last question, just based on time, I'm just wondering if you want to share the polling results with everybody.
Sure, thank you very much for that. So the question was, do you believe it would be responsible for Justin Trudeau to call an election during the pandemic? 67% of people on the call strongly disagree with Trudeau calling an election. 15% somewhat disagree, 8% somewhat agree, and 10% strongly agree. So there you go. That's our last polling question of the evening, but we have time certainly for one more question and maybe even two.
And if you don't get to ask a question tonight, just a reminder that you can leave a voicemail at the end of the call, and those will be forwarded to Daniel's office. So without further ado, let's take our next question from Rachel. Rachel has a question about the CERB.
Hi.
Rachel, you should be live.
Hey, thank you. I collected CERB along with a lot of other people here in Manitoba because we were laid off due to COVID. Now we're faced with income tax time, and a lot of us are wondering whether we're going to get almightily dinged by with income tax on CERB, which should have been taxed at the source in the first place.
Thank you very much for the question, Rachel. As I had said earlier in the call, I am the NDP's critic on CERB. I agree with you that I think it would have been a lot easier on people had CERB been taxed at source, so that people who were already in pretty serious financial straits weren't in the position of having to try to calculate themselves what they thought their tax was going to be and then put that aside when they're already making some pretty tough financial decisions. What the NEP has called for is, leniency for people to be able to make a plan for how to pay the tax on that. For people who are really in a low-income situation, we think this is just really vital. We have to remember what the purpose of the CERB program was. It wasn't just, like the whole point of the CERB was to ensure that people who are going through a really tough time because we've got massive unemployment and a real economic problem didn't end up out of their homes and didn't end up not being able to put food on their table, didn't end up in bankruptcy. That was important on a human level in order to take care of our neighbors. It was also important on an economic level to make sure that when we can get into recovery mode, that people have the resources in order to be able to participate and spend in the local economy. If we decide to bankrupt people now by demanding unreasonable repayments, which is happening, like for instance, kids aging out of foster care who ended up taking CERB because they were told to, and they were told that they were entitled to it instead of applying for provincial assistance, for instance, because it wasn't a time where they could find a job if they aged out of care last summer, and now they're being told to pay it back. Well, the government's not going to get the money back. What they're going to do is ruin the future of these kids who might otherwise have a shot at making something of themselves. And when it comes to people paying the tax and they don't have that money right now, I don't think that's helpful either. What we need is for the CRA to actually work with people in a way that it is not known for doing, to have reasonable timelines according to which people could pay those bills so that we don't end up just bankrupting people 9 months later or 6 months later or whatever it happens to be. for those folks depending on when they lost their job. So I think this is one of the big projects of the government. They really kicked the can down the road by not taxing the benefit at source. That is coming due, and we are pushing them to have a plan to work with people to make sure that everybody gets through this on a decent enough financial footing. So that gives you a sense of our thinking around CERB and the need to continue to support people financially. We are not out of the woods. We're not out of the woods from a public health point of view. We're not out of the woods from an economic point of view. And so those supports have to continue in just the same way that our healthcare effort has to continue until the pandemic is well and truly behind us.
Thank you so much for that answer, Daniel. We'll try to get in one more quick question, and I think we will have to wrap it up. A reminder, you can leave a message at the end, and Daniel will get to listen to that. So our next question is going to be from Frida, and she has a question about vaccines. Frida, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. You want to ask Daniel?
Yeah. Because I suspect we will be dealing with new variants in the coming decade, I would like to know how serious the government is about building a facility to manufacture vaccines in Canada, perhaps even in Manitoba.
Well, thank you very much for that question. And, you know, it's a good question. How serious is the government? To be honest, I'm not sure. I know that the NDP is very serious about wanting to build these facilities and to have them publicly owned and managed in the public interest. I think that's really important. When we talk about, I'm no fan of international pharmaceutical companies. I've often criticized them. I've criticized trade deals that protect intellectual property, that allows them to charge exorbitant prices for drugs. I don't think that should be allowed. That's part of what the vote on pharmacare was about today in the House of Commons. And we're doing those big drug companies a big favor if we don't develop our domestic vaccine capacity. And if we can produce vaccines domestically, then we have also a better bargaining position with those companies, because right now they know they've got Canada right where they want us. We don't have the ability to do it ourselves, which means they can charge what they want and they can deliver when they want, because we're waiting on them in order to be able to get it done. So the Liberals have made an announcement about wanting to invest in a facility for domestic vaccine production. I also think that that needs to be publicly owned. And what I can tell you generally is, and a big part of my frustration, one of the reasons I ran for office, is that I think, Liberals and Conservatives both are too often deferential to big companies. So we saw that on the vaccine front. They, instead of, like a lot of other countries, getting rolling right away on how we could have a government-owned domestic vaccine production, they went to the big companies and said, what can you do for us? When we look at big companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon that aren't paying their fair share of taxes here, instead of the government stepping up and making them pay their fair share, they take a path. And, the list goes on, like even in long-term care. We've been calling on the government to get profit out of long-term care. They refuse to go down that road. The NDP is the only one calling for that. Why? Because when it jeopardizes the interests of a big company that makes a lot of money, the government under the Liberals blinks. And what we need is stronger leadership than that. Not because we want the government to be controlling everything, but because when it comes to certain of those very important things, we want to make sure that Canadians' best interests are being looked after, and that's the number one thing, and that big corporations aren't the ones that are calling all of these shots. We need people who really have the public interest in mind doing that. So totally on board and pushing as a New Democrat for publicly owned domestic vaccine production, and we're going to have to wait and see how serious the current government is about getting that job done.
Thank you so much for that answer, Daniel. And I think that kind of brings us to the end. If you want to quickly wrap it up.
Sure, that sounds good. I guess it is 8 o'clock now. So I guess by way of closing, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to everybody who took the time tonight. I know we didn't get to all of the questions in the queue. As Ariel mentioned earlier, there's going to be the option to wait on the line after the call. It'll go to an answering machine. Please do leave messages. I do get back to people on those. Sometimes it takes a little while. The House is sitting now. It's a busy schedule, but I do want to get back to you if you have questions or you want to talk about some of the issues that came up in tonight's call. So again, it's very easy. You wait on the line, and you're going to be able to ask those questions. I appreciate the discussion tonight. I appreciate you weighing in those straw polls and giving a bit of feedback. I know it's been a really difficult time, and I think it's been hard on everyone to be, kind of trapped in their home and to not be visited in the way that we're used to, and to not be able to get out and about. And I know that it's starting to wear a little bit thin. So I hope tonight, for those of you who are on the call, was at least a little bit of a break in that routine and an opportunity to talk to your member of parliament about some of those things that have been on your mind and that you're wondering about or reading about in the news, and wondering, what else is going on behind some of those issues. So thank you very much for taking this time with me tonight, and I wish you all good health, and look forward to speaking again. Thank you so much. Have a good night.